The morning Sarah Witham walked 60 Tamworth hogs down the trailer ramp. And into her apple orchard, 3 men stood at the fence across the road and laughed. They were not laughing quietly. Earl Tootle, who ran 260 acres of commercial apple trees, and had never once doubted a chemical spray schedule in his life, threw his head back so far his pioneer seed cap nearly fell off. Walter Henley, who had farmed his 180 acres for 12 years, on a bank installment plan, slapped the fence post with an open palm. Otis Boggs, whose walrus mustache trembled when he laughed hard. The 3 of them shook their heads the slow, patient way men shake their heads when they have decided a woman is about to do something foolish. And then they walked back toward their spray sheds, and their chemical rigs and their comfortable certainty. Sarah watched them go. She did not say anything to them. Her husband Henry, standing beside her at the trailer ramp, did not turn his head toward the fence. Their daughter Margaret, 20 years old, and wearing one of Henry's old denim work shirts, did not turn her head either. Their son Thomas, 17 years old, stood at the front of the trailer, with one small hand resting on the fender. The 60 hogs walked down the ramp, in a slow single file, and spread out under the apple trees. And the Witham family watched them go. And the morning was cool and dry. And none of them laughed back. That was the spring of 1979. By the autumn of 1985, Cornell University had formally declared the Witham Farm the model reference site for heritage orchard management in the entire Eastern American apple region. Sarah had not arrived at this decision by accident. She had arrived at it by reading. The farm had come to her from her uncle Edmund Pratt, who had died in his sleep in August of 1968. At the age of 64. Leaving the 80-acre orchard and the small white clapboard farmhouse to Sarah and Henry. In a careful longhand will, Edmund had been a quiet man who kept a leather journal and trained as a pomologist in Kent, England, in the early 1920s, under 2 scientists named Ronald Hatton and Maurice Pickering, who had spent years studying what happened when you put pigs in apple orchards. What Edmund had learned in England was this: the codling moth, the small worm that bores into apples and ruins them, has a life cycle with a vulnerability in it. In early summer, the first generation of larvae fall to the orchard floor inside damaged fruit. If something eats that fruit before the larvae can pupate and become moths, the cycle cannot complete. Fewer moths means fewer eggs. Fewer eggs means fewer larvae the following season. And so on, compounding downward until the population collapses. Tamworth hogs, an old, lean, red-coated heritage breed, are exactly the kind of animal that roots through fallen fruit on an orchard floor. Edmund had understood this in 1926 and spent 39 years proving it on the same 80 acres Sarah now owned. His journal documented the results. An average of 640 bushels of apples per acre per year, across nearly 4 decades, without a single application of commercial insecticide. At the time he stopped farming in 1968, his orchard carried approximately 70 lady beetles per tree and 40 parasitoid wasps per tree, both natural predators of orchard pests, both thriving because no chemical spray had ever touched them. When Sarah and Henry inherited the farm in 1968, they kept the system running through one more harvest. Then the bank offered them a renovation loan, and the county extension office was recommending a chemical spray protocol called Guthian. And it seemed like the modern thing to do. They sold Edmund's remaining Tamworths to a pork buyer in Geneva and sprayed the orchard for nearly a decade. The spray seasons produced more fruit at first. 700 bushels per acre. In the early years. Better than Edmund's number on paper. But what the sprays also produced, quietly and invisibly, was the near total collapse of every beneficial insect in the orchard. By the late 1970s, the lady beetle count had fallen from Edmund's 70 per tree to 7 per tree. The parasitoid wasp count had fallen from 40 per tree to 4 per tree. The orchard was producing more fruit, but it was doing so in an ecosystem that had been hollowed out completely. In the winter of 1978, sitting at the long pine kitchen table, with Edmund's journal open between them, Sarah and Henry read an entry Edmund had written. In August of 1966. He had looked across the road at Earl Tootle's commercial orchard and seen, with the naked eye, a codling moth population that was beginning to show resistance to Guthian. The spray was no longer killing them the way it once had. Edmund's entry ended with one sentence. He had written, I am concerned that the modern commercial spray protocol is hollowing the resilience of the small American apple orchard. Sarah read that sentence in the winter of 1978 and ordered 60 foundation Tamworths from the same heritage livestock breeder in Geneseo, New York, where Edmund had bought his original 12 hogs. In the spring of 1929. The hogs arrived in late February 1979. Sarah turned them into the orchard on the second Sunday of March. The first year was hard to watch on paper. The fall 1979 harvest came in at approximately 420 bushels per acre. That was 33% below Edmund's historical average, and well below the commercial spray average. Sarah and Henry had been running. The orchard was in transition. The beneficial insects needed time to recover. The codling moth population needed time to be suppressed. Edmund's journal had documented exactly this. A first-year dip was expected. And he had written the expected range down precisely. But knowing something is expected, and watching your yield drop by a third, are two different experiences. Henry pruned the trees every late winter with the long-handled brass-bladed orchard shears Edmund had bought in England in 1926. Sarah managed the movement of the hog herd through the orchard's 8 quadrants across the summer, rotating them on a careful schedule, so no section was overworked and no section was neglected. Margaret walked the central quadrants every Saturday morning and counted lady beetles on a set number of trees, recording the numbers in the family journal, at the kitchen table. In the afternoon, Thomas walked the same quadrants every Sunday evening and picked up a small linen bag of fallen apples, which he and Henry opened together after supper to count the larvae inside. This was the data. Not a university's data. Not a county extension office's data. A 20-year-old woman counting insects on Saturday mornings. And a 17-year-old boy counting worms in fallen apples on Sunday evenings. The Family Orchard Journal that Edmund had kept for 39 years now had a new set of hands. writing in it. The fall 1980 harvest came in at 470 bushels per acre. The fall 1981 harvest came in at 540. The fall 1982 harvest came in at 600. Each year the number climbed. Each year Margaret's Saturday morning beetle counts climbed with it. Each year Thomas's Sunday evening larva counts fell lower. By the end of the 1981 season, the lady beetle count per tree in the Witham orchard had recovered to approximately 60 beetles per tree, against a documented Wayne County commercial orchard average that year of approximately 7 per tree. The orchard across the section road, Earl Tootle's 260 acres, was being sprayed on a 2-week Guthian cycle by 1982. Because the standard 4-week cycle was no longer suppressing the moths. The resistance Edmund had noted in 1966 had been growing quietly for 16 years. A county extension agent named Wendell Reeves had known Edmund Pratt. Wendell was a soft-spoken man who had grown up on a dairy farm in Cayuga County and trained in pomology at Cornell in the late 1940s under a scientist who had himself studied under Edmund's teacher, Maurice Pickering. Wendell had read Edmund's journal at the kitchen table across 7 summer visits before Edmund died, and he had quietly attended Edmund's funeral in August of 1968. At the close of the service, he had crossed the church parking lot and told Sarah, who was holding young Margaret in her arms, that the Pratt farm had been the reference site for heritage orchard management at the Newark Extension Office for 7 years, and that he hoped she would continue the work. Sarah had nodded once and said nothing. Wendell had stopped by the Witham farm every May across the long spray years, recorded the insect population counts without comment, and said nothing about Edmund's system. He was not a man who pushed. When Sarah turned the hogs back into the orchard in March 1979, Wendell came out 6 weeks later, walked the 80 acres with Sarah and Henry for 3 hours, and recorded the baseline numbers in his field notebook. He came back every May for the next 6 years. Every November, he forwarded his reports to the Cornell Pomology Research Station in Geneva. A Cornell researcher named Robert Fry had been reading Wendell's forwarding packets since 1979. In May of 1983, Robert came out with Wendell for the annual visit, pulled 12 sample apple bushels from across the orchard, and ran a codling moth larva survey. He did not tell Sarah and Henry that Cornell had been quietly tracking their farm as the regional reference site for the heritage Tamworth and orchard system. He did not yet know that within 2 years, knowing that would matter very much to a great many people, the winter of 1984 was warm and wet. The November and December rainfall across Wayne County came in at nearly 150% of the 30-year average. The codling moth populations across the commercial orchards of Wayne County overwintered in the warm wet soil at approximately 10 to 12 times the historical survival baseline. They emerged in the spring of 1985 in numbers no one had planned for. and no spray schedule had been designed to handle. At the same time, the primary soil fumigant, used alongside Guthian, had been cancelled by the EPA some years earlier, removing the second layer of chemical protection most commercial growers had relied on, and the codling moth resistance to Guthian that Edmund had first observed in 1966 had, by the spring of 1985, become a documented and undeniable fact. On a warm wet morning in April 1985, Earl Tuttle walked out of his farmhouse before sunrise and crossed his West 40 to the fence corner at the section road. He stood there and looked at his spring fruit set. The new apple canopy showed approximately 17% uniform brown spotted codling moth larva damage. By May, the regional commercial apple industry losses across Wayne County had reached $14 million. By July, $31 million. By September, $48 million. In documented losses across the county, Earl's farm was carrying a renovation bank loan he had taken out in the late 1970s to replace his spray rig. Walter Henley had made years of careful monthly installment payments on his farm and was close to owning it outright. Otis Boggs was also carrying bank debt from the same period. The codling moth larvae had cut Earl's yield to 12% of his 5-year commercial baseline. Walter's yield was at 14%. Otis's was at 11%. The combined 3 farms went onto the Wayne County Tax Assessor's quarterly auction list in early September 1985. The foreclosure listing ran across the front page of the local paper on a Thursday morning. The Witham Orchard, across the section road, reported 0 codling moth damage across the entire 1985 growing season. Robert Fry drove out from Cornell on a bright Monday morning in July 1985, in a dark green university station wagon. He stepped out in a gray sport jacket and a green wool tie and walked the 80 acres with Sarah and Henry for the better part of the day. He pulled 12 sample bushels. He walked every row with a lady beetle survey frame and recorded 120 individual tree census samples. Then he sat down at the long pine kitchen table in the clapboard farmhouse and read Edmund Pratt's leather journal from the first entry to the last. The 39 years of the original system, the long years of chemical spray, the 6 years of recovery, in slow and careful silence. When he finished reading, he said that the Witham farm had become, as of that morning, the single largest documented field-scale working example of the pre-1950s American Heritage Tamworth and Orchard Integrated Pest Management System in the entire Central Lake Ontario fruit belt, possibly in the entire Eastern American apple region. He said he would file a formal commendation report to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Service that Friday. He said he would recommend the Witham farm as the regional reference site for the documented heritage system. The fall 1985 harvest came in at 688 bushels per acre, the highest number in the combined Witham and Pratt orchard record, going back to 1929. A heritage cider maker named Tobias Pendleton drove down from Cooperstown in September and offered Sarah and Henry a 3-year exclusive supply contract at $12 per bushel. The Wayne County commercial commodity rate that week was $3.20 per bushel. The total fall 1985 harvest was approximately 55,000 bushels. The Pendleton contract brought the Witham family approximately $660,000 from that single harvest. The combined revenue of the 3 foreclosed farms across the road in their final season was a fraction of that number. On a Saturday afternoon in November 1985, Earl Tootle walked into the Newark Grange Hall. In a borrowed white cotton dress shirt and a dark wool tie and polished Oxford shoes. He had no Pioneer Ball cap. He had no warm beer. He walked to the lectern and said, into the microphone, in a voice no one in that room had ever heard him use before, that there was no longer a Wayne County Apple Growers Association. It had been dissolved by unanimous vote of the 3 founding members. The previous Monday evening, he said he had come to apologize publicly to Sarah Witham and Henry Witham, and Margaret Witham and Thomas Witham, for years of public mockery. At these monthly meetings, he read the apology aloud from a handwritten page. 3 paragraphs. He had written it at his kitchen table 2 days after the foreclosure notice ran in the paper. When he was done, he folded the page and walked across the meeting room to the 3rd row, where Sarah was sitting. He stopped in front of her and held his hands flat against the front of the borrowed shirt. And he said quietly, "I am sorry." Sarah did not stand up. She lifted her eyes and met his for 3 slow seconds. She said, "Thank you." 3 weeks later, on a cool dry evening in late November 1985, Sarah and Henry and Margaret and Thomas sat together at the long cider pressing bench at the back of the small wood and tin cider house, and pressed the last batch of the fall Roxbury russet harvest by lantern light. The hogs were quiet in the orchard outside. The work continued.